Obviously, the unemployment rate is down from where it used to be in the spring, so there's not as many problems. But once we started kind of hitting the ground and talking to people, there's still a lot of issues of people who haven't gotten paid. But just to look at some of the numbers, at the peak, Michigan had 996,000 workers on unemployment in a given week, which was almost a quarter of the workforce. Right now, it's at about 7%, which is about 300,000. So it's still much higher than it was back in the spring, which was maybe 2 to 4% were on unemployment. But so we kind of talked to people, and there was a lot of issues that people were still having. And they were able to finally connect over the phone, but it still took hours, whereas before in the spring it was virtually impossible. So we talked to the agency to see, hey, what have you guys improved and what still needs to get better? So here's a couple interesting numbers we got from them. So back in spring, the UIA, the Unemployment Insurance Agency, had 650 employees. Now it has 2,800 employees, so it's more than quadrupled. Now, some of those are temporary workers and contracted workers, so that might not stay forever. Another interesting number is just the number of people who are answering the phones, because, gosh, it was hard to get people to answer the phones. At the start, there was 110 people answering the phones. Now there are 1,200. And the number of calls has really gone down since the spring. I think once people get their claims started and once it gets rolling, then they don't need to call anymore, right? At the peak, there was 120,000 calls per day, and they were only answering about 5% of them, so 1 in every 20. Now they're getting about 35,000 calls a day, and they're answering about 50 to 60% of them, which is still frustrating if you're part of that group that isn't having their calls answered. So I talked to Steve Gray, who's the director of the agency, and he said that the biggest priority for him is getting not 50 or 60% of the calls answered, but 100% of them. And one big change that I think is going to really help with that is in the past couple of weeks, they've started a call appointment program. So you can go online and you can schedule an appointment for whatever time during the day, and then they call you. So you don't have to wait on hold and you don't have to wait for all these things. The biggest problem is there's not a ton of appointments available, and you can only do it a week in advance. So it's still really pretty tricky to get one of those appointments, but it's a lot better than having to wait on hold for hours.